They called him mad, stripped him of his crown, locked him up, and 2 days later he was dead in a lake too shallow to drown in. Bavaria. August 25, 1845. The mountains were there at his birth, the way they are always there in Bavaria, massive and indifferent and beautiful, pressing against the sky at the edge of everything. The baby was named Ludwig Otto Friedrich Wilhelm. He was the firstborn son of Crown Prince Maximilian, heir to a dynasty that had ruled Bavaria for 6 centuries, and on the day he was born the Alps were probably doing what they always do, which is simply exist, at a scale that makes human arrangements feel provisional. No one knew yet what he would build against them. He grew up at Neuschwanstein, a neo-Gothic castle his father had reconstructed above a glacial lake in the Bavarian Alps. The walls were painted with murals. Lohengrin, the Knight of the Swan, arriving in his boat, pulled by a white bird, Charlemagne in golden armor, knights and enchantresses, and the whole gorgeous machinery of medieval legend covering every surface from floor to ceiling. His father had commissioned these images as decor. Ludwig received them as revelation. He was a child who understood that the world inside paintings was better than the world outside them. He was not close to his father, a measured and academic man who found feeling inconvenient. He was not close to his mother, who found it difficult to be warm to a child who seemed to need so much of it. He had few friends. He had the painted walls, and the mountains outside the window, and the lake in the valley below, and in the evenings sometimes the light fell across all of it at once, in a way that was almost unbearable. Too much beauty, too much suggestion of something larger and more meaningful just beyond reach. He spent his childhood reaching. He read everything he could find about the medieval German world his walls depicted. He read the sagas of Charlemagne. He read the Arthurian cycles and the Norse legends and the poems of Schiller and the philosophy of Schopenhauer, who told him that art was the only true escape from the suffering of existence, that the person who could lose themselves entirely in a piece of music had achieved something close to transcendence. Ludwig understood this passage completely. He was 14 years old and he had been waiting for someone to say it. When he was 15, he went to the opera for the first time and heard Richard Wagner's Lohengrin. This is the moment everything begins. The knight arrives in a boat drawn by a swan. He is perfect and otherworldly, and bound by a condition he cannot explain. If the woman he loves asks his name, he must leave. He asks only to be trusted. Completely, without question. The woman cannot manage it. The knight leaves. The swan takes him away, back into the mystery he came from. And the woman is left in an ordinary world with the memory of something extraordinary she was not quite capable of believing in. Ludwig sat in the dark and wept. He was not weeping for the woman. He was weeping because someone had finally said the thing he had not been able to say himself. That there is a world of such beauty and perfection that ordinary life cannot sustain it, that the transcendent cannot be held by ordinary hands, that some things are too pure for the world as it is, and must remain just beyond it, forever approached and never quite reached. He was 15 years old, and he had found the artist who would define his life. He did not know yet that he would one day have the power to change that artist's fate, or that changing it would be the most consequential thing he ever did, or that it would also be the beginning of the end of him. He simply sat in the dark and felt, for the first time, completely understood. On March 10, 1864, his father died of pneumonia at 52. Ludwig was 18, studying in Munich, when the message arrived. He was not prepared. He had never been prepared. No one had thought to prepare him because no one thought he would be needed this soon, and also because it is not entirely clear that Ludwig could have been prepared for anything by conventional methods. He had the kind of mind that could not be prepared. It could only be ignited. Overnight he was King Ludwig II of Bavaria. The Bavarian people came out into the streets to look at him, and what they saw was a young man of extraordinary physical beauty, 6 feet 4 inches tall, dark-haired, wide-eyed, with the kind of face that made people reach for words like luminous and then feel embarrassed for having reached for them. He rode into Munich on a white horse. He delivered his speech with a gravity that suggested a much older man. He was so perfectly what a fairy tale king is supposed to look like that some people in the crowd must have found it unsettling. Reality does not usually produce this. Within weeks of taking the throne, he wrote a letter. He had located Richard Wagner in exile in Vienna, 50 years old, bankrupt, hounded by creditors, living in other people's houses and composing music that the world did not yet have ears to receive. Wagner's great cycle, Der Ring der Nibelungen, was half-written and seemingly unperformable, too enormous, too strange, too expensive, requiring stages and orchestras and singers that did not yet exist. He was, as a human being, exhausting. As an artist, he was the closest thing to a prophet that the 19th century had managed to produce, and Ludwig knew it. The letter was not a diplomatic communication. It was a declaration. I wish to rescue you from the petty cares of everyday life. I intend to compensate you fully for your past sufferings. You are my sole delight and friend. Wagner read it in a state of disbelief. Then he accepted. Of course he accepted. A young king was offering him money and protection and unlimited artistic freedom, and all that was required in return was being worshipped by someone genuinely capable of understanding what he had made. This is one of the stranger bargains in the history of art, and both men understood what they were exchanging, and both men needed it with the particular desperation of people who have spent too long being misunderstood. For a year they were inseparable, the old composer and the young king. Wagner installed in a villa on Lake Starnberg, Ludwig riding over in the mornings to sit with him. Letters exchanged daily in language that reads, even now, with the intensity of a love affair. Whether it was one remains disputed. What is not disputed is that Ludwig loved Wagner the way you love something you believe has been sent to save you, absolutely, without qualification, in a way that frightened people who witnessed it. The Munich establishment was not saved by Wagner. It was appalled by him. He was arrogant and extravagant and entirely incapable of confining himself to music when there were political opinions to offer. He suggested ministers be dismissed. He criticized court policy. He spent money that was conspicuously not his on furnishings and silks and elaborate domestic arrangements that scandalized everyone who saw them. The government threatened to resign en masse. Ludwig had to choose. He chose the government. Wagner was expelled from Bavaria in December 1865. He never stopped supporting him. He funded the completion of the Ring cycle from a distance. He paid for the construction of the Bayreuth Festival Theater, Wagner's purpose-built opera house, still standing, still hosting the festival every summer, still the most famous operatic venue in the world. Tristan und Isolde had its world premiere in Munich under Ludwig's patronage. So did Die Meistersinger. The whole vast second half of Wagner's career, the work the world now considers his greatest, existed because a young king in Bavaria had been willing to empty his treasury for it. When Wagner died in Venice in February 1883, Ludwig wept in private and said almost nothing in public. By then he had retreated so far from public life that most of his grieving happened in rooms where no one could see him. He had learned to grieve alone. He had learned many things alone. It was becoming, by then, the only way he knew how to do anything. Here is what the politics wanted from him. It wanted a king who attended cabinet meetings and read memoranda and signed legislation and appeared in public often enough to remind his subjects that Bavaria was a functioning state with a functioning monarch. It wanted a man who would sit at the table when Bismarck's Prussia came calling, when the wars of German unification began reshaping the map of Europe, when small kingdoms had to decide, quickly and carefully, Which enormous power to stand beside. Ludwig sat at those tables. He sat at them and endured them the way a person with a profound aversion to noise endures a loud room. By going somewhere else inside himself, waiting for it to end, emerging afterward diminished. He was not stupid. He understood Bismarck perfectly. He understood that after Austria was crushed at Sadowa in 1866 and Bavaria found itself on the losing side, the old German order was finished. He understood that when the Franco-Prussian War came in 1870 and France was destroyed at Sedan, Bismarck needed the southern German kings to complete the new German Empire, and that Ludwig, as the most prestigious non-Prussian monarch, was the keystone. He understood all of it. He signed the letter inviting Wilhelm I to become German emperor. He accepted the secret annual payments from Bismarck's wealth fund and understood the transaction for what it was. He was selling his kingdom's formal independence for money he would spend on beauty. He did not feel guilty about this. He felt something more complicated, which is that he had been born into a role that the world had already decided no longer mattered, and that the only thing he could do with the power he had left was spend it on something that would outlast everything: the politics, the Prussians, the cabinets and councils and negotiations that filled his days with a gray, exhausting fog. He could build. He could build worlds. He began at Neuschwanstein. The crag above the Platte Gorge near Füssen had been visible from his childhood bedroom at Hohenschwangau, a jutting spike of rock with the mountains rising behind it and the lake glittering below. He had looked at it for 18 years. He had imagined something rising from it for almost as long. In 1869, he began to build. He commissioned the theatrical set designer Christian Jank to provide the visual concept, not an architect, a stage designer, which tells you everything you need to know about what Ludwig was building. The practical architecture and engineering were handled by Eduard Riedel and later Georg von Dolman, but it was Jank's theatrical imagination that determined what the thing would look like. And it was Ludwig who reviewed every plan personally, who wrote letters demanding specific changes to cornices, insisting on a particular shade for a ceiling, redesigning rooms from 600 feet away with the confidence of a man who carries the vision so completely in his mind that reality has no choice but to catch up. What rose from that crag was not a medieval castle. Medieval castles were built for defense, for cold practicality, for the management of violence and siege. Neuschwanstein was built for something else entirely, for the sensation of inhabiting a legend, for the physical experience of existing inside the world that the painted walls of Hohenschwangau had described to him when he was a child who could not yet build his own. The throne room was modeled on Byzantine churches, on the mystical kingship of the medieval world, divine right made visible in gold and mosaic. Ludwig designed it to hold a throne that would complete the image. The throne was never installed. He died before it could be placed. The empty dais stands there still. The steps rise toward nothing. It became, without anyone choosing it, the most accurate symbol of his life, the space prepared for something that was always about to arrive and never quite did. The Singers' Hall was perhaps the greatest room he ever made. Soaring and golden, lit by hundreds of candles, its walls covered entirely in scenes from Parsifal and the legend of the Holy Grail, the cup that cannot be reached, the wound that will not heal, the knight who must be pure enough to ask the right question and always arrives one moment too late. Ludwig sat here alone in the evenings, in the flickering light, while musicians played in the empty hall. He never invited audiences. He never wanted anyone else to see it. It was his alone, which is the only way he knew how to hold anything he loved. He built Linderhof next, in a folded valley in the Alps, and finished it in 1878. It was the only one of his 3 great projects he ever completed. He lived here more than anywhere else in his final years, which perhaps means it was closest to what he actually wanted. Not the grandeur of Neuschwanstein, not the imperial ambition of Herrenchiemsee, but this small, exquisite palace in the French Baroque style, surrounded by forest, hidden from the world, where a man could be alone with beauty. and no one would come. He dined alone every night at a mechanical table that rose through the floor from the kitchen below, so he never had to see a servant's face during his meal. He sometimes set places for invisible guests, Louis Sif, Marie Antoinette, Madame de Pompadour, and spoke to them across the candlelit table while the alpine night pressed against the windows. He was not confused about whether they were real. He simply preferred their company to the company available to him, which is a different thing. Behind the palace, tunneled into the hillside, he built the Venus Grotto, an artificial cave inspired by the opening of Wagner's Tannhäuser, where the knight is trapped in the underground kingdom of the goddess and cannot decide if he wants to be saved. Ludwig had a conch shell boat in the grotto's underground lake. He would be rowed across the water in colored electric light, one of the first buildings in Bavaria to use electricity, the colors cycling from blue to red to gold, reading or simply sitting, in an underground world entirely of his own making. He was the most powerful man in Bavaria. He had the mountains and the lakes and the forests. He was approaching 40 years old, and he sat alone in a fake cave and had dinner with the ghosts of dead French aristocrats. This is not madness. This is what happens to a person of extraordinary interior richness who has been given nothing adequate to pour it into. His personal life was its own country, with its own weather and its own wars, and almost no one was permitted inside it. He had been briefly engaged, in 1867, to his cousin Duchess Sophie Charlotte of Bavaria. He broke off the engagement after months of delay, without real explanation, to Sophie's bewilderment and public humiliation. He never showed romantic interest in any woman. His closest relationships were with men, with Wagner, with a series of equerries and actors and stable hands he favored intensely, and then, often suddenly, dismissed. His diaries suggest a man of profound internal conflict, not someone who did not know what he felt, but someone who knew exactly what he felt and found it impossible to reconcile with the world as it was arranged. He wrote of his struggles with longing, with shame, with the desire to be different. He prescribed himself cold baths and prayer and isolation. He built walls, literal walls, in his castles, where hidden passages and mechanical devices minimized the human contact he simultaneously needed and could not tolerate. The architecture of Neuschwanstein is the architecture of his psychology. The private spaces, the hidden doors, the rooms prepared for a presence that never comes, the throne with no throne in it. By the early 1880s, the debts had reached a scale that frightened even the people paid to manage them. He had spent approximately 31 million marks on his castles. This was his money, the wealth fund payments, his personal inheritance, not the Bavarian state treasury. He was scrupulous about this. He did not want to take from Bavaria. He wanted to give Bavaria something. He just needed to borrow quite a lot first. By 1885, he owed some 14 million marks. Creditors were writing threatening letters. His ministers begged him to stop building. He refused. He sent envoys to France, Turkey, Brazil, Sweden, requesting personal loans. He was refused everywhere. He was a European king in the age of Bismarck's Germany, and Europe's banks had no interest in financing a private dream. His ministers began to make other calculations. In the spring of 1886, the government moved. Prime Minister Johann von Lutz and a coalition of senior ministers, with the backing of Ludwig's uncle Prince Luitpold, decided that the king must be removed. The motives were multiple: the debts, the years of political absence, the embarrassment of a monarch who communicated with his cabinet by letter and had not attended a council meeting in years. And beneath all of it, the simpler desire of men who wanted to govern to have a monarch who would let them. To remove a ruling king required a finding of incapacity. They needed a doctor. Dr. Bernhard von Gudden was the director of the Munich District Lunatic Asylum and one of the most respected psychiatrists in Europe. He was commissioned to produce a report on Ludwig's mental state. He interviewed former servants. He read written statements from courtiers and attendants. He reviewed the records of Ludwig's behavior over the past decade, the reversed sleep schedule, the solitary dinners, the conversations with invisible guests, the extravagant building, the rages, the sudden dismissals. He never examined Ludwig. He never met him. He never asked him a single question. From this, Dr. von Gudden produced a 23-page document declaring Ludwig permanently and incurably insane, suffering from paranoia so advanced that he was entirely incapable of governing. The report was presented to the Bavarian cabinet on June 8, 1886. Prince Luitpold was declared regent. Ludwig was to be confined. Ludwig was given no hearing. He was not permitted to respond. He was not allowed to face his accusers. He did not know the diagnosis existed until after it had already been used to take his kingdom. Whatever Ludwig was, and the honest answer is that no one fully knows, and the question may not have a clean answer. He was not given the chance to be anything other than what the government needed him to be, which was gone. On the night of June 11, the commission arrived at Neuschwanstein. Ludwig ordered resistance. His castle guard detained the officials, and for a brief, extraordinary few hours it seemed that the king might hold his fairy tale castle against the machinery of Bavarian governance. He stood at the windows and looked down at the men below, and thought whatever a person thinks when everything is ending. By morning it was clear that the army and the roads belonged to the government, and that a fairy tale castle, however beautiful, is not a fortress when the people with guns have already decided the outcome. Ludwig was escorted from Neuschwanstein before dawn and placed in a carriage. He asked his equerry to bring him poison. None was brought. He was taken to Berg Castle on Lake Starnberg. He was 40 years old. He had been king for 22 years, and the morning light was coming across the water the way it does in Bavaria, flat and gray and indifferent and very beautiful. He had less than 24 hours left. On the afternoon of June 13, Ludwig asked Dr. von Gudden, the man who had never examined him and had signed the paper that ended his reign, if he might take a walk in the grounds. Gudden agreed to go with him personally and sent the usual attendants away. They left at approximately 6:30 in the evening. They were never seen alive again. At 11:30, search parties found both men in the shallow water of Lake Starnberg. The water was 3.5 feet deep. Ludwig's overcoat was floating nearby, turned inside out. Von Gudden had injuries on his face and neck consistent with a violent struggle. The official verdict was drowning. Probable suicide. There are other theories. There have been other theories for more than a century. Murder by a government afraid of what a recovered or litigious king might mean. Escape attempt. A final act of violence by a man who had nothing left to lose. The post-mortem findings have been disputed. The lake has been searched. The accounts of witnesses have been examined until the words have been worn smooth. Nothing conclusive has ever emerged. Some accounts claim the autopsy showed no water in the lungs, which would argue against conventional drowning. The actual forensic record is ambiguous, and historians remain divided on what the examination conclusively showed. The lake gave what the lake chose to give, and kept the rest. What can be said is this: a man who had spent his life reaching towards something just beyond him walked into water that could not have drowned him and did not come back. Whether that was chosen, or accidental, or something done to him, the result was the same. He was gone. The mountains were still there. The castles were still there. The morning light was still coming across the lake. He had wanted to remain an eternal mystery, to himself and to others. He succeeded. Within weeks of his death, they opened Neuschwanstein to the public. In the first year, hundreds of thousands of people came. They made the walk up from the valley and passed through the gates and stood in the Singers' Hall with its gilded scenes of the Holy Grail, and stood on the terrace with the Alps spread out below them, and stood in front of the empty throne dais with its steps leading nowhere, and they understood something that his ministers had never understood. This was not the work of a madman. A madman cannot sustain a vision of this specificity and this scale across 17 years of detailed architectural correspondence. A person who has lost their grip on reality cannot design a room this coherent. What they were seeing was the work of a man whose grip on a different reality was so complete that ordinary reality simply could not compete. Neuschwanstein became one of the most visited places on Earth. It appears on the German €2 coin. Walt Disney acknowledged it as the direct visual inspiration for Sleeping Beauty Castle at Disneyland, which means that the image burned into the imagination of virtually every child born in the second half of the 20th century as the shape of castle, the dream architecture of towers and turrets and impossible height against a mountain sky, came from a king in the Bavarian Alps, who was trying to build the world he saw when he closed his eyes. He wanted to give people his dream to live inside. He did. It just took him dying first. The Venus Grotto at Linderhof still glitters in its underground lake. The Hall of Mirrors at Herrenchiemsee still reflects. In 17 mirrors facing 17 mirrors, an infinity of candlelit images receding into a distance that has no end. The Singers' Hall still waits with its golden light and its scenes of the unattainable grail, and the empty place where the music once was. The castles are full of people now, thousands of them every day, in every season, climbing toward something they felt the pull of before they knew what it was. A place that feels more like the world is supposed to feel than the world usually manages to feel. He built that. He did that. A man who sat alone in a shell boat in an underground cave, reading by colored electric light. In a world no one else could fully enter, he made something so beautiful that 140 years after his death, 1.5 million people a year are still making the journey up the mountain to stand inside it. Here is what no one could have told him, because he died without knowing it. The dream was enough. The dream was, in the end, more durable than any policy he might have implemented, any alliance he might have managed, any conventional kingship he could never quite achieve. The cabinets and councils and compromises that his ministers valued, those are footnotes now. The castles are not footnotes. His ministers wanted a king who would govern. He gave them something that will outlast every government Bavaria has ever had. Whether that was worth the cost, the loneliness, the long retreat from the world, the lake in June, the empty throne, the death at 40, is a question each person who walks through Neuschwanstein answers quietly to themselves. In the moment they step onto the terrace, and the Alps open up below them, and something in their chest lifts without warning. He wanted to remain an eternal mystery. Stand on that terrace on a clear morning, with the light coming off the lake and the mountains filling the whole sky, and the towers rising above you exactly as he imagined them. And tell me he failed.